Okay, we're live. All right. So, my name is James Militzer. I'm the editor of NextBillion Financial Innovation, and today we have as our guest Clara Miller, president of the FB Heron Foundation. Welcome, Clara. Thank you for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, Jim.
Briefly, the FB Heron Foundation's mission is to help people and communities in the United States to help themselves out of poverty. And it has done this over the years through grant making and increasingly now through impact investing, focusing on enterprises that create reliable income streams for people striving to get out of poverty. The foundation has long had a commitment to deploying its endowment assets for its mission, and this summer it expanded upon that commitment by publicly committing to move 100% of its assets to impact investments by the end of 2017. So a bold move from the foundation, and we wanted to talk with Clara today about that move and about other related issues. I guess to start up, maybe you could talk a little bit about the rationale behind your decision to move 100% of your assets into impact investments. And I understand that the decision was precipitated, or at least influenced to some degree by an examination of your own endowment portfolio. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about what you learned from that examination and how it was a wake-up call for you.
Okay, well, I'll start from what precipitated. You know, when one's mission is to help people and communities help themselves out of poverty, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to say, well, if that's our mission as a private foundation, we need to double down. And we basically said to ourselves, we can't leave any resource on the table. We have to go full bore. And on top of that, it really made it clear to us that one of our duties as a fiduciary, as a philanthropic institution, is of obedience to mission. So it's a duty of care, duty of loyalty, and a fiduciary duty also of obedience to mission. And we think that applies to all our assets. So from our point of view, it was really to make sure that we were complying with our fiduciary responsibility. So then we say to ourselves, well, let's look down here and see what we actually have in our portfolio, because as you say, that's, you know, you start out and you say, what do we have? Is it possible that some of the things we have in our portfolio might be detracting from helping people in communities help themselves out of poverty? So we started that, actually we started that journey a couple of years ago. And it was, surprisingly, it was harder than we thought it would be. I'll put it that way. You know, what you discover is that many of the holdings you have, let's say if you have a mutual fund with public companies in it, are in instruments that that make it hard to see through to the enterprise level. So when we think about investing, and investors generally talk about asset classes and asset allocation in their portfolio, and you have bonds and you have stocks and you have whatever, and they're usually in funds, and it's hard to see, well, what are those actually the companies that we are holding stock of in those asset classes. And we looked below the surface in order to find out, are those things that we think are contributing to our mission, or at least not distracting from it. And that was a more difficult journey than we thought it would be. In my 2013 President's Letter, I think I referred to it as heroic. It is finding that information and examining those companies.
I wonder, is that difficulty one of the reasons why it'll take until the end of 2017 to accomplish this shift, or are there other factors involved?
Well, there's it's the kind of thing where you say to yourself, okay, let's be careful. Let's look carefully. Let's do some due diligence on each one of these positions. Folks who now invest know that certain kinds of assets, if you're holding them, are relatively illiquid. That is, you have a kind of a period during which you actually can't get your money out to put it into something else. Private equity funds are one example. So there's some bumps along the road. If we wanted to kind of put it all into an ESG fund tomorrow morning, we probably could. But we want to really find out what's under the surface. And the reason we want to do that is we want to be able to really track the progress, both positive and negative, social and financial, together over time in our whole portfolio.
Interesting. I wonder, can you kind of briefly define what impact means in Heron's case? Like, how good does a company have to be included, or how bad does it have to be excluded from your portfolio?
First of all, I should say Heron has a view of impact that is among a wonderful pluralistic discussion in the impact investing world. On one end of the spectrum are people who say that these are companies that are intentionally going to do good and solve problems, and we invest in them and we think that's great, but we're a both-and kind of organization. So we say we also think public companies have a lot of impact, and in fact maybe more impact than we would like to admit. And we both have to solve problems on one side and actually kind of stanch the flow of problems coming from large public companies who aren't fulfilling their societal, I think their societal duty personally. But at any rate, so what we're looking for is best of class. And we do believe that organizations that start out, that there's no real bad companies and good companies. There's no saints and sinners. It's sort of like people. And sinners can be redeemed and saints can fall from grace. And we think that about companies too. And that's why having good metrics to track their performance over time is so important. Because just like for a financial portfolio, it's not as if you buy a stock and say, I'm just going to hold this forever because it's good, right? You actually pay attention to what's happening to it over time, and you might decide, well, it's not doing so well, we're going to make the decision not to hold that for a while. And then if it improves in performance, bring it back on.
Okay. I wonder, are there any metrics that you find more important when you're making that assessment of who to include in your portfolio or not? Or, I mean, are there any that do you like have a hierarchy of which metrics are can't miss and essential, and then which ones that a company can maybe take or leave?
This is a field that is hopefully rapidly developing. It's a little like financial metrics. I mean, if you asked a financial analyst, do you have any metrics that you absolutely have to have in a company to know that financial performance is going to be sterling? I think you'd get a lot of answers, and I think that's the case with environmental, social, and governance tracking of metrics. But it's complicated because they're so different for every industry group. It's different if it's a large public company versus a relatively small business. There are a lot of variables that are being looked at. Now, from our point of view, we're interested in jobs and decent jobs for people we care about. So we're looking at employment. Is it up? Is it down? What kinds of wages are they paying? Are they fair with their employees? Are there danger signs? That's the kind of thing that we would start with that lens. That's not the only thing we look at, but that's the lens we would start at from a social point of view.
Okay. I wonder, beyond like what you've mentioned as far as unwinding different investments and identifying them in your portfolio, have there been any unexpected challenges involved in making this transition to 100% impact? And has it changed your overall approach to investing, or has it impacted the performance of your endowment in any way that you can notice so far?
Well, starting from the endowment performance, it's been good. We now have a website where we've been as radically transparent as we can about our financial performance over time. And people are welcome to go there and see for themselves. We're a private foundation. We have a regulatory rubric, which means that we need to maintain purchasing power over time and pay out and spend every year 5%. So our return, kind of floor would be 5.5% real, as the foundation investment officers say, and we are in business and expect to remain so as long as poverty is a problem. So that's working fine. In examining the portfolio, I think that the challenges, or maybe the surprises would be a better way to put it, have been finding. So if given our mission, one of our largest holdings, of course, was Walmart, as it is in almost everybody's portfolio, and we had to say to ourselves, gee, they're a really great company in some ways, but if our mission is one of employment for people who are trying to get out of poverty, we have to really think about how that conforms with what we're trying to do, and how we might influence Walmart to think differently, perhaps, about its employees. Similarly, we had the largest employer of public company real estate investment trusts was the Corrections Corporation of America, where it looked to us like prisoners and guards were employed because it had a huge number of employees. Well, gee, if we were just using a really blunt instrument to figure out whether there were more jobs, that wouldn't be a very good job. Right? So we have to look at quality as well as quantity in all these things. And the final thing I'd say is that we really found one of the social metrics are pretty poor. The social data that public companies are required to report is pretty poor, and we're trying to work on finding better indicators. But in the meantime, things like we found definitely that corporate social responsibility, which is a box that gets checked as positive, is a sort of an intention, and it sometimes is a false positive for a company. And when you're looking for socially screened investments, a lot of organizations that just have good corporate social responsibility practices or intentions will be in there, when really they probably don't belong there for other reasons.
I wonder if you could mention if you're aware of any other foundations that are making similar moves to Heron's, and if not, what you think might be holding them back. And relatedly, if you have any advice for other foundations or investors who are considering this kind of a move.
Well, I can say that it's been a slow, kind of a slow forward motion toward doing more of this or thinking more about this. What's interesting is that foundations were at the forefront of impact investing if you define it as being part of grant making and program-related investing. So foundations such as Ford or Rockefeller or MacArthur, for example, and others, I'm sure I'm leaving lots out, have been instrumental in starting Grameen Bank or in getting community financial institutions off the ground here in the States. So they've been great at that, kind of cracking the code of going to the other side of the house, because most foundations have a very bright line between their philanthropic part and their investing part, has been a much bigger challenge. And while there's starting to be some foundations making significant moves in that direction, you've got somebody like the McKnight Foundation, or you have KL Felicitas, which is a 100% for mission foundation. You've got the Kresge Foundation, which just now made a $300 million commitment. So there's really starting to be some forward motion there. We got a ways to go.
Very good point. I wonder, how big a difference do you think it could make to a company like Walmart that you mentioned if more major investors and endowments were to screen them out because of like their employment practices or their pay rate for their employees? Is there a tipping point to how many big investors or everyday retail investors have to respond before you will start to see more rapid evolution in these metrics amongst major companies?
Well, I think that the well-managed companies, and I would put Walmart in that bucket, care very much about their reputation. I think it's very much a part of their brand equity. I think it impairs their brand to be perceived as being kind of socially irresponsible or environmentally irresponsible. And I should say, Walmart has a terrific record as a green company, so it has, it's like all of us, we're not perfect, as I said before. And the other piece of the puzzle is there's both the brand equity as customers see it. So that's one important piece of the puzzle, especially for a consumer products company. But there's also the fact that these ESG factors, which at one time when analysts looked at public companies, or private companies for that matter, were not considered material risk to investors. That's changing. These social factors or environmental factors, they're material risk. The BP disaster, a lot of insiders said everybody knew BP's safety record was terrible. But somehow that never actually got into the public company reporting, as a material risk to investors in the 10K statement. That's changing. The organization I'm involved with, called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, is specifically focused on data standards for environmental, social, and governance factors for public companies, so that they will be reported in a standardized and comparable way on their 10K filings with the SEC. That's a huge change in the DNA of investor land.
Well, on a related point, I got a question from our audience here, kind of related to what's been in the news lately with VW and their deception on their environmental standards. The question is, do we need more intermediaries like B Labs, B Corps to certify the social and environmental merits of companies? Do you have any opinions on that?
Well, maybe. I think we certainly need, it's interesting, we have reporting, and we have, financial reporting, as well as now increasingly social environmental governance reporting. And B Lab is, and those groups are kind of about incentivizing companies to essentially embrace this idea as part of its management culture, as part of its business plan. I think that is a wonderful thing. In the case of Volkswagen, this was company-wide systemic fraud, and one would hope that some sort of audit would have caught that. There's no real auditing or assurance process for ESG factors, and this is a good a good example of where it might have made a big difference to investors. There was an article in the New York Times this morning that was about how there are kind of highway side ways to monitor emissions from various kinds of cars and track them as those various kinds of cars as they drive around, and that those might have actually flagged the fact that Volkswagen's actual emissions performance was far lower than what was being picked up on the equipment of the testers. So it would be very interesting to probe that. I think you've made a good point, and the questioner has too.
We got another question coming in from Twitter from Giving Strong. They ask if you feel there's an ideal proportion between public impact investing and philanthropic grant making that would allow you to achieve mission.
I think that grant making is it's interesting because the IRS has a 5% floor, has become a 5% ceiling for many of us in the foundation world. We're not actually thinking about how to capitalize nonprofit organizations to be sustainable and to be strong in order to do their amazing work. We're not thinking about them at the enterprise level, just like we think about, when Heron looks at an investment, we take the role we try to take the role of an equity provider in our grant making as well as in our other kind of investing. So we want to protect that enterprise. I think that on the grant making side in the foundation world, and grant making is a very big thing, I think there's a long way to go to really understand the financial role of grants in the life of the nonprofit sector. But I think that certain kinds of grants are hugely important to that sector. I don't think that the foundations have really parsed how to distinguish how to make money turn into mission in an efficient way. But I don't necessarily think it's all about the amount.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, I wonder if you can point out any risks that you've noticed in transitioning to 100% impact investments, either in terms of the performance of your portfolio or potentially harming companies or even industries that might be causing positive impact in some areas but falling short in others, and they get screened out by your process that happens to focus on the metric that they're short on, for example.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that's the other side. I mean, you have to be a responsible investor on all sides, right? But I wish we had so much power that when we decided to divest from something or other, the corporate world shuddered in fear. That would be great. But I don't think that's the case right now. I think really the risk in all our investing, we all focus on our risk as investors. From the point of view of a philanthropic institution, the risk is almost entirely to beneficiaries. And we want to share risk. We, in some cases, agree to take risk, but we do not want to shed risk onto beneficiaries. And I think that's all too common in the investing world. It's about shedding risk, and sadly, it's to people who are the most vulnerable sometimes in society.
Well, I wonder. I don't mean to suggest that Heron alone might achieve that kind of impact necessarily as far as harming an industry, but I don't know if you've noticed lately. We covered it a little bit on NextBillion that a impact investing fund came up that is trying to push back from the political right against impact investing on the basis that it is harming quote, American industries like coal and fossil fuels and firearms manufacturing by directing investment dollars away from those industries and towards what it describes as more left-leaning areas like climate change and things like that. So I wonder, I mean, if, impact investing continues to grow on the trajectory that it has been, and let's say it becomes, more of a mainstream type of investing, do you see any risks? I mean, maybe not necessarily along the lines of what this politically based fund is complaining about, but any risks in that certain industries might be starved of funds when maybe they are being unfairly excluded?
I don't see kind of social investing as a sort of divisive political argument. I'm surprised that they would feel that way about it. I know, in this organization I was talking about, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the the people who are behind making kind of data standards for public company reporting on ESG standards are not, wild-eyed crazies. I mean, these are the chairman of the board is Mike Bloomberg. The vice chair is Mary Shapiro, who was appointed to the SEC by Ronald Reagan and then again by George W. Bush. Another one of our co-board members is the head of CalSTRS, which is one of the largest pension funds in the world, and there are several, really very skilled asset managers and accountants and lawyers. This is it's on the one hand about material risk to investors, and I think values investing includes people who are not in any way left or liberal. There are people who, let's say, have religious objections to certain kinds of things. So there's this is a big tent. And I'm not sure why those conservative groups are fearful. I think they should get inside the tent.
Well, it's interesting. I actually got into a little bit of a discussion with an advocate of this conservative approach to impact investing, and his language was, it was very similar to the language that the sector uses in general. He insisted that the point of advocating for more investment in the coal industry was to alleviate poverty in like Appalachia, where coal jobs are an important part of the economy, and he framed it in anti-poverty terms. I wonder, does that kind of argument, if you zero in on that particular employment metric, you could say that the coal industry, for example, is having a positive social impact on poverty in certain regions. Is that a challenge in any way to trying to sort out what kind of companies to invest in?
I don't think these are clear situations. I think in the case of, let's say, coal, I don't think that the people of West Virginia should have to choose between water and air pollution and jobs any more than I should, or members of Congress should, or captains of industry should. And I don't think those people think so either. I think that when you look at comparable metrics for companies, you look for the best. You want everybody to go up the curve. This isn't just about eliminating one company because it's bad. It's actually about rewarding the companies that are doing well in each industry. So you could possibly find someone, for example, in the fossil fuel industry who has a terrific record on innovation and moving to a less polluting world and improving its carbon footprint if somebody with environmental and climate change concerns were looking at that company. So I don't think it's as scary as that person imagines it is.
Yeah, I would agree. I wonder if you could point to any trends that you see that you think will affect the relationship between philanthropy and impact investing in the next 10 years.
I think that the problems we face as a world and as a country are so systemic and so large that we have to, we basically can leave no stone unturned. And I think philanthropy's job is to really stand at the door of, is to basically stand for the public good through the lens of its own mission. And I think that if we are not fulfilling our fiduciary responsibility of obedience to those missions by leaving assets undeployed, I think we're missing a huge opportunity and we're not fulfilling our duty. So I think it'll start becoming one resource among others, and in concert with the rest of the world, as opposed to removed from it.
All right. And related question: what do you see as the biggest obstacles in the next 10 years to impact investing becoming more mainstream?
Biggest obstacles. I guess mostly, oddly, it's the culture and the belief that somehow we have this nonprofit sector over here of small, good-hearted organizations whose job it is to clean up after an increasing, a private sector that is seen as somehow not having any obligation. And I think that most people in the private sector understand that nonprofits are actually for where there's a failure in private markets to provide for something, whatever it is, food for people who are hungry, let's say, and the private market has to be functional and has to be getting better in making sure it is fulfilling its job, which is to make the world a better place, right? And I think that profitability is part of that, but it's not maximum profits in the short term. That will just, that doesn't actually make anybody's life better in the long term. So I think that's what has to happen.
Well, thank you. I wonder, one last question for you. I understand you're going to be at the SOCAP conference next week. Do you want to give us a little preview of what you'll be talking about?
Oh gosh, I think I'm on a panel. I know I'm on a panel. And I believe that the idea is that in impact investing, having a better taxonomy to talk about this spectrum I was talking about. We have kind of on the one end is people looking at public companies and saying, how do we make sure that they're providing maximum social and financial value together to investors and to others and to society. And on the other end, we're looking at small nonprofits and sometimes for-profit social enterprises who have a really great idea of how to solve a problem. And when we say impact investing, investors say, well, which is which? What's what? And I think the idea of the panel is to try to find common ground on a way to talk about the differences and the similarities in a taxonomy that makes sense to folks.
All right, well, I'm going to be at the conference. I'll look forward to your panel. Hopefully we'll cross paths there.
Okay.
Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's it. And thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us. And we'll look forward to hearing more about Heron's progress in the coming months.
Okay. Me too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.